Likewise, Natalie. Sorry, we're not live yet, so likewise.
Hello, and welcome to today's virtual Hinckley Forum. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley Forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. Today's forum is presented in partnership with the University of Utah's Political Science Department and the Kem C. Gardner Policy Institute. Each major election year, the Hinckley Institute of Politics and Kem C. Gardner Policy Institute collaborate on informed decisions, an effort to educate Utah voters on critical policy issues and to better acquaint them with competitive candidates from key races throughout the state. The Informed Decisions 2020 Election Brief and Policy Forums will examine three key policy challenges in the state: education funding, housing, and economic recovery. This year, we are thrilled to welcome the University of Utah Alumni Association as a partner to help engage the public on these critical issues. We would like to thank our streaming sponsor, AARP Utah, for making our virtual forums this fall possible. And we would also like to thank our media sponsor, KCPW, for recording and rebroadcasting our forums as part of the Hinckley Radio Hour. Today's forum is Informed Decisions 2020, COVID-19 and the Utah Economy. We are joined by panelists Peter Phillips, Mark Nold, Nubia Pena, Phil Dean, and our moderator, Natalie Gochner. If you have questions for our panelists, please enter them into the YouTube chat. We will address questions once we have completed our moderated panel discussion. And with that, I'll turn the time over to our moderator.
Thank you so much, Anne. Great to be with you today. I am so excited for this panel because we're going to talk about COVID-19 and the Utah economy. And as we know, the COVID-19 is a health crisis, but it's also a huge economic challenge for our state, for the nation, for our world. And I love having the panelists we have today. We are less than 2 weeks out from Election Day. And so excited to have Phil Dean, who is the budget director, the Governor's Office of Management and Budget Director and Chief Economist in the Governor's Office. Mark Nold, a good friend, Chief Economist at Workforce Services. Nubia Pena, who's the director of the Utah Division of Multicultural Affairs. She brings the law school perspective to this group of economists. Nubia, we're grateful for that. And Peter Phillips, who's a professor of economics at the University of Utah, who specializes in labor market issues and has been a mentor to many young economists in the state. So welcome to all of you. Great to have you. I want to just kind of share a brief introduction of the topic. Really, every facet of Utahns' economic life has been impacted, upended, altered by the COVID-19 pandemic. You know what? Utahns feel the sting of lost jobs, lost income, insecurity about their economic future, uncertainty about potential long-term changes that impact the economy. And it really begs the question, what do voters and candidates need to know to make informed decisions this election year? Pandemic expert and historian John Barry, he's the author of the book, The Great Influenza, said the most important lesson from the 1918 flu pandemic is to tell the truth. And the truth is, Utahns will continue to face significant uncertainty about the spread and the economic impact of COVID-19 virus for the remainder of this year and into 2021. So I'm excited today to kind of paint this picture and share with students and others in the community who are interested in this topic what the experts are saying. So Mark Nold, I'm going to have you unmute yourself, and I'm going to come to you first and just ask you to paint a picture for the audience of what's happened to our economy since mid-March.
Okay. Well, the employer data reporting that finally came in now for the second quarter of April shows that the Utah economy, employment-wise, had contracted by 7.6%. That's actually really close to what the initial surveying had thought. They had said 7.3% contraction. Now on paper, the job gains throughout 2019 were wiped out because of this, as was another 117,000 jobs. To go from no growth all the way down to minus 7.6 would be a loss of 117,000 jobs, but we had also had to probably take away about 30,000 jobs just to get down to 0% growth. So the total job loss is probably around 140,000 jobs. The good news, if there is such a thing as Utah's 7.6% job reduction, was the least job reduction in the nation. Its economic rebound is also one of the nation's best. And so on our current trajectory, as we see this, the economy rebounding, Utah could be back to job neutrality by the year's end. And what I mean by that is maybe by December, we could be back to zero job growth or zero job loss, however you want to categorize that or classify it. But in April, when the economy was impacted the deepest, half of the jobs lost were in the leisure and hospitality industry. So the economy is really hitting unproportionately different segments of the economy. An additional 18% job loss was in retail trade, another 18% in education and healthcare. And so together, leisure, hospitality, retail, trade, education, healthcare, together, these made up about 86% of all of Utah's job loss. By June, healthcare had improved, so had retail trade. So the job losses were still spearheaded by leisure and hospitality, some education jobs, and then some additional lingering in the retail trade industry. Now, again, ground zero of the economic setback is centered upon the leisure and hospitality sector. It includes recreation, entertainment center businesses, restaurants, and hotels. Now, about 38% of these jobs are held by people below the age of 25, whereas those below the age of 25 across the whole Utah economy only account for 19% of all Utah jobs. So COVID has disproportionately impacted the youngest segment of the labor force. So much of the economic actions to protect all of the population is actually hitting the youngest part of the labor force in a greater disproportion. And it also impacts lower educated workers, and by extension, probably minority groups can probably be classified as being disproportionately impacted by this setback. So in summary, this really has not been an equal opportunity economic setback. It has centered upon certain industries really hard and are still lingering in the leisure and hospitality industry. And so a lot of the higher educated jobs and workers and so on, we might not be downtown doing our jobs, but we are sitting at home doing our jobs. So there is not just impact upon age groups, education tiers, and so on. You can also say that the downtown Salt Lake City or heavily concentrated employment centers are also feeling a severe disruption, because again, in the end, the employment counting in downtown Salt Lake City will show restaurant losses and so on, but not office job losses. But yet those office jobs we're not in the office doing the job, we're at home doing the work. So we're also seeing that large employment centers like downtown city, Salt Lake City, Houston, whatever, all over the country are being disproportionately impacted by this economic COVID environment.
Yeah. Mark, thanks for painting such a full picture there. And Newbie, I'm going to come to you in a minute to ask about the impacts on the state's multicultural community. But before we do that, Peter, I'd love to just hear your reaction to what Mark has shared. You're an expert on labor market economics. This has been an incredible shock to our system. You hear a lot of people talk about, well, shocks can be like a V-shaped recovery. My guess is you don't believe that, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Oh, and Peter or Dr. Phillips, I'll have you unmute there.
The standard for economic downturns since the Great Depression was the recession of 2008, where the overall economy in the United States lost 6 to 7% of all jobs. And it took 5 years for the economy to come back and get those 5 or 6% of all jobs back. So it took 5 or 6 years just to get back to go. This current downturn that is still not received an official name, but I'm calling it the pandemic recession, fell twice as far as the Great Recession and fell twice as fast. And so when that was happening in March and April and May of this year, my stomach was just full of butterflies, like somebody had cut the cable in an elevator, and me and the rest of the labor market were falling like a rock.
Yeah.
But amazingly, sometime in May, the economy bounced back faster than any time since the Great Depression, and faster than the Great Depression itself. And so it looked like we were about to experience the mother of all V downturns, where we went down fast and then we came back up fast, and the elevator cable had not been cut. We were on a bungee cord and we were on our way back. But what made that into a bungee cord was the mother of all stimulus that was twice as big as the stimulus that was created for the Great Recession, and it came twice as fast as the stimulus for the Great Recession. And now we're at an inflection point, at a moment of decision, at a moment of possibilities and risks, and that is that stimulus is drying up, that the unemployment insurance assistance, the small business assistance, they're all getting played out at this point, and they were the elasticity that brought the economy back so sharply. And while we've bounced back, it's not clear whether it's a real bounce back or what the stock market folks call a dead cat bounce, because we're still below, in terms of job losses in the United States, the bottom of the Great Recession. We still have lost about 7 or 8% of all the jobs in the United States, instead of 6 and 7%. And are we going to shoot back up and as Mark suggested, maybe be back to go by early next year? Or are we going to, at this point, run out of steam and start the slow process of recovery that could take years? Now, that's a question that I hope the panel gets around to talking about later. That is the drama and the dilemma that we're facing at the moment.
Yeah, Peter, thanks for painting that in such vivid terms. I love the elevator cord versus the bungee way of thinking about it. Phil, we're going to come to you, but Nubia would love to hear your commentary. Both Peter and Mark have kind of set up the real challenge for the overall economy. You can help us understand how it affects the multicultural population.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much, Natalie, and such a pleasure to join you all today during this panel. So just to provide some context regarding my position, so as the director for the Utah Division of Multicultural Affairs, our division has a mission. I apologize for the noise in the background, but our division has a mission to create an inclusive climate in Utah, as well as elevate the voices of multicultural populations, specifically the needs and gaps that communities of color are experiencing, to our state leaders. And when the governor, he declared a state of emergency on March 6th, we very quickly recognized that the pandemic was going to have socio-cultural and economic implications that were unique to communities of color. And as Mark mentioned already, the implications are disproportionately affecting communities that are lower income, and oftentimes also communities that are racialized communities. So what we've noticed is that there have been unique barriers around housing security, food insecurity, language accessibility. The digital divide is steep, and children right now who are trying to navigate online learning environments are struggling with the fact that some households still do not have access to Wi-Fi. They don't have access to technology. So when we think about how that is affecting our future workforce, we need to consider that that disparity will continue to grow, and the educated workforce is being affected by what we're seeing right now. The jobs that have been lost, as mentioned, from our hotel and restaurants, those were oftentimes held by those from communities that are marginalized and systematically disenfranchised. So we know, again, that there are communities that are going to have different impacts in the way that this pandemic is developing and the way that their loss of income and their wages are going to affect their families. So how is that affecting intergenerational poverty? And there was a report that was also drafted by the US Department of Labor that talked about how nearly 60% of the jobs eliminated in the first wave of the pandemic were held by women. So there's also a gender perspective that needs to be included. But that number also fails to consider how silenced and systematically isolated women, specifically women of color, undocumented workers, and people who are paid under the table, have less structural protections to begin with. So this trend uniquely affects children when women are more likely to be single parents, and they are the ones who might be hardest hit when the economic downturn is now in full swing. So there's a lot of intersectional and interconnected parts of this conversation that we need to elevate. And so again, I'm just glad that you've reserved space on this panel so that we can talk about how it's not just all communities, but there are some communities that are feeling the brunt of the economic implications in our state as well as nation. And I look forward to unpacking that with you all today.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Nubia. Glad to have you on the panel and hear that perspective. Phil, I was going to ask you to summarize this from a state budget perspective, and you're certainly welcome to do that, but I would love to hear your reaction to what Nubia shared, Peter and Mark. You have a vantage point that most of us don't have. You get to be behind the scenes in meetings with legislators and with the governor, have been a very integral part of the state's response. Are you agreeing with what you're hearing? What would you add?
Yeah, I definitely agree. And a couple of pieces that I want to highlight that we see. The first thing I want to talk about is the relationship between the pandemic and the economy. Sometimes, especially as I look at other states, they're often viewed in competition. It's either work on the economy or work on the pandemic. And here in Utah, we've taken the approach that those are completely interrelated. We're never going to experience full economic recovery until we have the ability to manage the virus, be that through different measures that are taken, through vaccine, whatever it is. But people aren't going to have the confidence to be out and about and do things as they normally did until we do have better control of the pandemic. So those concepts are interrelated. Another thing I think, especially about the Utah economy, that I'll focus on, that it's been remarkably resilient throughout this time frame. Certainly very hard hit as the pandemic took hold. I remember the feeling, maybe to use another analogy, of like the sand shifting under my feet, right? Like not knowing what was stable, not knowing what solid ground was, trying to figure that out. Those are certainly unsettling feelings, trying to work through that. But as was mentioned, the federal government has played a massive role with massive fiscal stimulus. We haven't seen anything on this scale or with this speed, and it has helped prop up the economy, both here in Utah and in the United States overall. And as was mentioned, we're kind of toward the end of that now, and the economy is going to have to stand on its own legs. And there may be additional federal support going forward. I certainly hope that's the case. But ultimately, we're going to have to figure out how to live with and manage the virus and engage in economic activity. The last piece I want to highlight is just looking at some of the disparate impacts that have taken place in between sectors of the economy. So we've kind of looked at that in different ways. But as you look at different sectors or subsectors of the economy, we're seeing significant shifts. So as was mentioned, restaurants in Salt Lake City may be hit really hard right now because people aren't in as many of the downtown office buildings, but you are seeing other areas with growth in restaurants, different types of restaurants. Sit-down restaurants not doing well. We're actually seeing tax revenue growth from other types of restaurants. So as you look over at all the state revenues, which reflect economic activity, have been doing remarkably well, but we're also seeing a lot of shifts in economic sectors. And I think one thing that the pandemic is going to cause is kind of accelerate or continue some structural changes that were already starting to take place. And this kind of gives an impetus to implement some changes, for example, with teleworking.
Yeah. Okay, great. Thanks all of you for kind of setting the stage. I got a bunch of follow-up questions. Peter, just want to hear your quick take on this. Why do you think that Utah, by a whole variety of measures, has been more resilient than most states as we've worked through this? I mean, our unemployment rate has been ranked quite well compared to other states. Our contraction's been small, the smallest compared to other states. We've seen other measures. Why do you think the Beehive State is holding strong even in a difficult time?
One reason it is held strong is, despite the fact that the scene behind me is Boulder, Utah, where my daughter has a farm, Utah, in fact, is a heavily urbanized state. And most of the economic action runs from Provo up to Cache Valley. And while it's a very urban state, it's an urban state with a highly diverse economy, not reliant on any particular thing such as high tech in Silicon Valley or coal and oil in Wyoming. So it's a diverse economy, it's an urban economy, and its economy doesn't have all of its eggs in one or two baskets. And as a consequence, it's less exposed to downturns that focus on real estate or focus on energy or focus on international trade. So Utah's economy is kind of agile of foot. So if these downturns were like a dodgeball game, you just can't hit Utah's economy because they're just too fast of foot dodging the hit. However, don't get too enamored with that fact, because another way of thinking about it is really what I heard Phil say is that there are interconnectednesses that have to be considered. The pandemic and the economy are interconnected. Utah is interconnected with the United States, and the United States is interconnected with the global economy. At the moment, this pandemic is particularly severe in India. And when Phil says we have to get the virus under control in order to get the economy moving again, that is not only a statement about Utah, it's a statement about the United States, and it's a statement about the world economy. So it's tough. And the other thing is, what I heard Phil say is that the pressures of this downturn are pushing towards what economists call structural adjustments, but what the average person says, changing the way we do things. And those structural adjustments or changes will take time. At the moment, I'm sitting in Boulder, Utah, and I'm on a panel in the Hinckley Institute. Later today, I am going to be chairing a PhD defense where the student is in El Salvador and the dissertation committee is both at Utah and other universities. This is a new thing for me, folks. I've never done this before, and it takes a lot of learning and it takes a lot of mistakes, but it is going to drive change in higher education. And DoorDash is going to drive change in the restaurant world. And commercial real estate, office buildings are going to have to adjust to the fact that people aren't going to want to get in elevators together, and people are going to want to work from home. And all of these pressures for change will take time. This interconnectedness of the problem will take time. I think Mark is very optimistic in saying that maybe this is a V-shaped recovery and we'll be back to go in early January or something like that. But I caution that this may be something that goes on for a long time as these adjustments slowly fall into place.
Yeah. Hey, Mark, you're welcome to comment on that. I just also thought it would be helpful for you to share with our viewers what you're seeing in labor force participation. So the idea is that this economic shock hits us, and some people become unemployed, and some people simply drop out of the labor force. And it's a big part of the story in the data. And I'd just love you to break that down a little bit.
Well, those measurements come through the United States Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it's part of the ongoing monthly unemployment rate calculations. The Utah, just to maybe define what labor force participation is for those who may not completely understand the concept, we look at the economy and say anyone 16 and older has the potential to be in the labor force. So if everyone 16 and older either worked or looked for work, it would be 100% participation in the labor force, but that's not the way it goes. So some percentage less than that is what generally comes across as normal. Before the Great Recession here in Utah, we had about 72% participation rate. That was impacted strongly in the Great Recession. It dropped about 6 percentage points. And I kind of do back of the envelope calculation, say every percentage point decline is about 20,000 people stop either working or looking for work. And so oftentimes you're not looking for work anymore. I guess we could maybe call it discouragement. The measurements so far that we see here from BLS in this COVID environment is that at most participation rate dropped about 1.5 percentage points. Again, that's not much in relation to what we saw back in the Great Recession. Peter had made mention that it took 5 years to get all the jobs back from the Great Recession decline. Peter's looking also at the bigger picture of the United States economy, where it will take longer than just, like I said, maybe the beginning of the year to get back to neutrality. Here specifically in Utah, we could get back to neutrality by the beginning of January, February, but that doesn't mean that's what's happening across the rest of the United States. But our labor force participation rate just hasn't fallen that much in this environment. So it's not showing a large degree of discouragement that's going on in the economy this time around as what may have occurred in the Great Recession. It also kind of goes to your question, maybe why is Utah doing okay in this quote unquote okay in this downturn and being, one of the best in the nation in terms of lack of job loss, recovery, and so on. I think it's largely to do with two things. One, it was how strong the economy was when this started. Our unemployment rate was down to 2.5%. I've never seen it lower. So everybody, so to speak, is employed and has a job who wants a job. That's kind of what a 2.5 implies. But also, I don't think the economy was asking for a recession. It's an external shock that came on the economy and forced it into a recession. Whereas by contrast, the Great Recession, there was something going corrupt inside the economy and that produced the recession. So it needed to heal from the inside out during the Great Recession, but in this one, it's just an external shock upon something that was feeling really good. And that helps in terms of bouncing right back as soon as you remove some of the government restrictions and so on. Now, it also produces and will make these structural mixes and changes that go on in the economy. But in summary to your question, the labor force participation rate doesn't seem to be as setback or as much discouragement in looking at the economy during this economic setback as it did, say, in the Great Recession.
Yeah. Nubi, I don't know how you're feeling listening to all this labor force participation rate and economic discussion. And this might be a little bit unfair, but would love to hear your comments. Peter said that this recession doesn't have a name, but he's calling it the pandemic recession. Some people are calling it a pink collar recession. And they're saying that because the occupations that appear to be most severely impacted might be things like flight attendants, restaurant servers, hotel helpers and the like. And then even the impact on women in the home as labor force participation rates drop, women drop out of the labor force because their kids aren't in school, or they are in school, but they need someone at home to help them. So I just can't help but ask you your thoughts on this notion of a pink collar recession and how this economic challenge is impacting women.
And thank you so very much, Natalie, for that question. And with your permission, I'd actually also just like to take a moment back with your question that was shared to Peter earlier, where you asked him, why is Utah doing well? And I did just want to acknowledge and thank our state leadership, because when the many programs that were coming out of the state level from GoEd or from other organizations, they were first initially offered as a first come, first serve. And after conversations with them and explaining to them, first come, first serve does not protect the individuals that can't navigate digital services and can't necessarily fill out the forms unless it's in multiple languages. They were willing to pause and pivot. And I think that there has been such significant partnerships developed and a collaborative spirit that has really come out of this unfortunate circumstance. And so I just wanted to also acknowledge that Peter is absolutely right. There's going to require time for the change to happen, but there's also a willingness that's required. And we're seeing that in Utah. Utah state leadership is willing to have conversations with communities that have been hardest hit and listen to them and asking them, what do you need in order for you to be able to compete in the market or to participate in these programs? So I just wanted to acknowledge that.
No, I appreciate that, Nubia. And just to double underline that, you know, we live in a state that had a published economic response plan to COVID by March 24th. That's pretty quick. Okay, so Nubia, on the pink collar recession, what are your thoughts there?
Yes, thank you. So I appreciate the term, and I recognize the impacts to those areas in the workforce that are being affected. What I think is also interesting is when we refer to the color pink, there's also this notion of gender, right? And how this might be attributed to how it's affecting women. We need to look at how domestic violence rates have also increased in our state. Women have not only lost jobs, but they have also lost the ability to financially find freedom from abusive homes. So when we're looking at how is the pink collar pandemic affecting our most marginalized communities, but also the communities from those that identify as women and the children that are living in those homes. So I think that there's many names that we could choose for this pandemic. This pandemic could definitely be a racial equity pandemic or a racial inequity pandemic because of what we've seen with health outcomes as well as economic implications. But definitely I would say, let's continue to find those strategies so that we can close the gaps and help the families who are hardest hit and most affected. So thank you.
Yeah. Phil, what's the latest you're hearing on federal stimulus? I mean, you know, this is dizzying because, you know, you have the House doing something, the Senate doing something, the president doing something, then it all gets thrown out, and then it comes back, and we're less than 2 weeks to an election. I can't for the life of me figure out why it's not easier to do something, given that it really benefits everybody that's going to be on the ballot to have some aid. What's the operating assumption in the state capitol at this point?
I wish I had a great answer to that. As you said, kind of dizzying and, to be honest, disappointing that Congress hasn't been able to come together and figure out something with the president in terms of a response on the economic side. I do think ultimately there will be some version, be it before or after the election. But I do think that's an important step to continue the economic improvement that we have seen, to have some additional fiscal stimulus. That being said, I think it's important to recognize that we can't rely on federal fiscal stimulus forever, right? We need to figure out what the new normal is in the economy, and certainly I hope and expect that the federal government will act. But we also need to figure out here in the state, what are we going to do? What are our strategies going to be given whatever the environment is, with the federal government, with what's happening internationally? What is our response going to be, and how are we going to set the future course that we want to be on? And I think that's an important thing, instead of just sitting back and waiting for the federal government to come in and solve our problems, figure out for ourselves, how are we going to proceed? Just two other things I want to respond as well. One, I just pulled up right before this, pulled up on Indeed.com. We have 35,000 job openings in Utah, showing in Indeed.com. I know Workforce Services also has a list, and I think that's above 30,000. So there are many, many job opportunities out there today. For some people, they may not have the skill set required. They may not have, it may not be the job that they want. But I think it is important to acknowledge there are many, many job opportunities out there today. And I think one of the important roles that the state can play is reorienting people to that new future, whatever that is, and engaging in training initiatives and helping people to have the skills that they need for the new economy. The other piece that I do want to bring up is I think there is pent-up demand out there. So you think, for example, the travel and tourism sector of the economy that has had very significant negative impacts. Like I've done camping trips and whatever around the state a fair bit, but I also want to get out and travel when I can. And I think there's pent-up demand that as people feel more comfortable in the future with that, again, be it through a vaccine or whatever else with the pandemic, like I think some of the sectors that have been the hardest hit do have the opportunity to come back. People are still eating. People still want to eat out. It's a matter of having that confidence that I'm going to be safe when I go out to eat.
Yeah, good. Thank you, Phil. Hey, Peter, I just want to ask you this because you are a knowledgeable and colorful commentator, but I'm really focused. I'm trying to get my head around what's going to happen over the next 6 to 8 weeks. And I say that because we know we've got these, high case counts nationwide. We've got a controversial presidential election. We're all worried about the transition of power and just what might happen there. It's seasonal flu season coming upon us, people spending more time indoors, a lot of virus fatigue. I'd love you to just give us your perspective from someone who's watched these social happenings for some time. What are you expecting over the next 6 to 8 weeks?
First, I expect that the virus challenge is going to get worse.
Okay.
What we have here in a pandemic is like a game of whack-a-mole, where one state like New York early on had high new virus infections, and that got whacked down. Now Utah has high virus infections, and maybe we'll whack that down. But it seems to have a staying power because of the interconnectedness across the country and the decentralized efforts at controlling this pandemic. And even if the United States had a consistent perspective, the whack-a-mole game is international, with Italy being up and now India being up. And so I expect not just over the next 6 to 8 weeks, but over the next year, that this virus is going to continue to plague us and plague our economy. In addition, even though we are in a process of a very rapid recovery, and even if we get our arms around the pandemic through a vaccine and better treatment, there is a potential for the downturn to take on a life of its own through a series of negative feedbacks that move away from the downturn that's driven by face-to-face concern with disease into the financial system through commercial real estate, through individual and business bankruptcies, and so on. So remember, we still haven't come back to where we were in the United States at the bottom of the Great Recession. We are not at the bottom yet. We've been down so long, it's beginning to look like up to us when it's not. And that creates a potential for the downturn to take on a life of its own. In the next 6 to 8 weeks, well, I don't know, Phil, what time is it? Have we got a stimulus today yet? I'm betting against the stimulus. I just think we've got too much political gridlock to get it done, but I admit I could be wrong there. Absent of stimulus, I think that the V-shaped recovery is going to lose steam nationally. And if it does, Utah can't get out of that wake and will be caught up in it.
Yeah. You know, Peter, a mentor of mine has been our former governor, Mike Leavitt, who, you know, was also the Secretary of Health and Human Services for George W. Bush. But he mentioned to me early on in this pandemic, he had the quote, nobody looks good during a pandemic. And he was just sort of making the point that a leader can look good for a little while, but then they won't look good, and then they'll look good. And it's the whack-a-mole point that you make. And I completely agree with you. So really interesting on that point. We have some questions that are coming in, and I'm going to put this one to Mark. Mark, we have someone asking, why is the stock market seeming to behave as if there's no pandemic? Love to hear your response to that.
I'll speculate, since I don't know 100% as to why, but I think it goes back to my original, or one of the points I had made earlier, that this recession is coming upon the economy from the outside. It wasn't a rotting from the inside. There wasn't a bubble in the economy. There wasn't something in the investor's mind or view before the pandemic hit where they saw that the economy had to fix itself or something wasn't working right in the economy. And so they're looking at the pandemic as something outside of the system, something that's coming upon the economy as a whole. Now they're gonna sit back and evaluate as to, as Peter made allusions to or was speaking towards, will the pandemic then move over to something inside the economy and corrupt it or make something bad happen with inside of the economy? And I think to this point, they're not seeing that as a whole or not seeing it yet or envisioning that something to that degree would happen. I think the stock market or the investors are still looking at the economy and saying, if we can get a vaccine, if we can get this COVID stuff off our backs, the greater economic fundamentals are such that we will migrate back towards where we were before the pandemic hit. And I don't think they're looking yet and seeing something that they think that, okay, even if we get a vaccine, we go back towards what we used to be. These other economic variables are now corrupted because of it. And therefore, will have to additionally stay into a bad system till they get fixed. Just that my speculation is overall, they're just not seeing where that would happen yet.
Yeah.
And still being optimistic that the vaccine will take this whole thing away and off we go again.
Yeah. Phil, there's also a monetary policy story here, isn't there, with the stock market? I know I'm giving you a leading question there, Phil.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, super low interest rates, right? And also fiscal policy. So both monetary and fiscal policy very much supporting economic activity. And again, looking here, Utah centric, I know, thinking about the stock market nationally, but we're seeing increases in sales tax revenues, not declines, right? So a combination of low interest rates, a very significant federal stimulus that has taken place, that my assumption is that many sectors of the economy are doing very well. I've heard anecdotally some say this is the best year I've ever had, right? So this shows up in the sales tax data, like in the kind of home improvement, garden center type places. We're seeing massive year over year increases. And, I thought initially in the kind of March, April time period, people are at home deciding to do things around the house, not able to get out much. So I'm going to work in the garden and whatever. But we're continuing to see that yes, we're seeing declines in some sectors of the economy, but we're seeing record level increases in other sectors of the economy.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Nubia, there's a little bit of a story here about hourly workers versus, people that make a lot of wealth in the stock market. I don't know if you want to comment there.
Absolutely, Natalie, thank you. So as was mentioned earlier on the panel, many of us have the privilege of being able to work from home and remotely log on and back back-to-back meetings and we're still compensated. But for those that are on the front lines, the essential market, the essential employees that are working at the factories or at the restaurants or at the grocery stores, they have higher risks of getting sick or potentially being furloughed than potentially we do. So there's also a conversation of privilege that I think we also need to consider in moving forward with economic relief efforts and strategies so that all of us are able to fully recover. There's also another conversation that we need to have in terms of the workforce in the future. As I mentioned earlier, with our children right now, when you look at zip codes, there are some households that have not logged on to school since March when schools closed. So how is that going to affect the future market that Phil was talking about in having skilled workforce? So how are we thinking about that in terms of closing the gap for not only achievement, but also ensuring that the diverse business owners that are interested in bringing their business to Utah have individuals that they can hire and retain? So again, this is a really interconnected, complex, and layered conversation. And it's really important for us to have a multifaceted perspective when we're thinking through those strategies.
Yeah, great. Peter, I know we got another question, and I think you're the perfect person to answer it. The person's asking, are there thoughts about how a Trump re-election or a Biden election would affect Utah? So this is, we're not necessarily political scientists, but we can think about how different election scenarios might affect the Utah economy. Let's let you share your thoughts, and then we'll get others to chime in.
I don't think people should be thinking of a Trump or a Biden election. People should be thinking of a blue, purple, or red election, because what matters is whether there is a consistent political viewpoint in Washington where one party controls the entire levers of government, or whether there is a shared governance. And I think it's likely that we're going to have a purple election. It's not 100% that that's going to happen. I think it's unlikely that it'll be a red election, and I think it is only slightly likely it'll be a blue election. Mm-hmm. So if the election is purple, then the role of the federal government in shaping the national economy, which will shape the Utah economy, will be confronting the challenges of political gridlock and disagreement. And if that's the case, and I suspect there's a good chance that would be the case, then it's not like Utah's on its own, because the message that I am trying to deliver is Utah can't get out from the crowd that far. It's going to be shaped by the broader economy, but the Utah economy will, as Phil suggested, not be able to turn to Washington for its solutions, because Washington is going to be tied in knots.
Yeah, very interesting perspective, Peter. And so I want to just add some interpretation there. So when you say purple, this would mean that perhaps the Republicans hold the Senate, the Democrats hold the House, and then whoever makes it for president.
President is going to have to deal with that split control.
Yeah. Phil, Mark, Nubia, either of you want to add anything on this question? As you think about it, I think I want to just add that I loved what Peter said about this isn't Biden-Trump, but this is more the coalition that's elected. And I had lunch with some colleagues yesterday that reminded me that you're not electing just the president, you're electing all of those political appointments that become secretaries, assistant secretaries, and on and on and on. And that's where so much happens, is in the political philosophies that are brought into important positions in our federal government. So just food for thought. Who wants to jump in there and say anything about what this election might mean to the Utah economy? Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, I thought Peter summarized it really well in terms of the politics. It does boil down to the color that falls out on the other side. I think you will end up with, like if it was a blue Democratic sweep across, that you would get some stronger actions economically in a single direction. than you would get if it was, obviously, as he said, with the purple, you're just getting, some barriers in the way and so on. So you're going to get some tax shifting. It seems to be that the summary looking towards Biden is that you would get some taxation that goes back towards taxing higher income levels and so on. And some look at that as good, some look at that as bad, and some of those kind of things. I think the question was, how does it impact Utah? Obviously, in the short run, there can be some nuances that occur and so on, but I think Utah is really under the spell of more of long-term factors that can even have strength to help override short-term nuances. It's also part of why, again, I think we're doing so well nationally inside of this setback. One is that internal birth rate that we have in the state of Utah. That is an economic machine. It just drives economic growth year after year after year. And then that by itself is an economic growth foundation. Now, in-migration either does nothing to it or turbocharges it. And we seem to be the target of in-migration, not just us, the Intermountain West. That's Idaho, us, Colorado, Arizona, so on. I've told this story before. We live in a part of the country that for 200 years was underdeveloped because the Industrial Revolution wanted to develop around us. It wanted factory settings, big products to go outputs. I need flat land, oceans, rivers, lakes to deliver these products. Mountains don't work. It was difficult to populate the Intermountain West because the economics wouldn't support it. Now that you have maturity in the industrial economy, and what I mean by is big highways, airplanes, big trucks and so on, and then you introduce the technology economy onto this that could care less about demographic or geography, you now have what can arguably be the most desirable part of the country to live in. The economic shackles are removed, and that's why you get this large influx coming in. You also get maybe disagreement or they don't like California. They come here. Even California's crumbs is a pretty good meal for Utah. So I think the politics, it's going to have its little on the edge factors and margins upon Utah, but I think Utah's economy lives much more on these bigger picture, longer term fundamentals.
Yeah, thanks for that, Mark. Phil or Nubia, you're welcome to chime in if you want to speak on the politics, or I'll go to the kind of our last questions. They're good. Okay, well, we've got about 5 minutes left in the program. I'm going to ask each of you to respond to something. Before I do, Phil, I thought it'd be helpful, since you are, really on the inside in terms of thinking about next steps for our state, our responses, helping to prepare the governor's budget, helping to prepare our legislature for an upcoming legislative session during this time. I'd love to hear your forecast for what's ahead. And you don't have to go out 2, 3, 4 years. I just would love to hear your thoughts through the remainder of this year and 2021.
Yeah, I mean, so as we've looked at it, we're projecting continued recovery, and certainly not projecting that we're going to be back to the growth levels that we were at coming into this recession, but especially relative to our prior forecast, which we did in June, where there was, I'd say, a lot more economic uncertainty reflected in that forecast, that we're projecting continued improvement taking place in the economy. It's, I think as we look at the unemployment rate, what's happened, I think we're getting to where it's more reflective of reality as we've been working through this pandemic period. I haven't known which of our economic indicators to really trust, but I think we're going to see continued improvement, that I do think we're going to benefit. And maybe if I do go out a little bit longer term, I think we are going to benefit from the new normal. As Mark's mentioned, some of these long-term structural changes, just the overall economic environment that we have in the state, that I do think that we're going to see continued improvement. I'm sure there will be bumps along the road as part of that, but we're projecting continued improvement.
Well said, Phil. Okay, for the last question, and I'm going to start with you, Peter, and it's because you and I talked offline a little bit about this, but I would love you to give some advice to the students who are listening to this presentation and have a labor market, a recession that's challenging, what advice would you give to students or even broader, business owners who are struggling to stay afloat in this difficult time? And then I'll ask that of everyone.
This generation of high school and college graduates have been born under an unlucky star. You do not want to get born into a downturn that is this deep. And no matter how much the bungee cord brings us back, you're only bringing us back to close to go, and that go is going to go slow. And so this is going to be a very challenging time. And what I tell my students is you've got to meet that challenge by being creative, by not locking yourself in, by not thinking through the visions of your elders, but creating your own vision. And that vision should be driven by two things. What is going to work and what are you going to love working at? And you have to balance those two things. You have to look for what are the structural adjustments that are creating new opportunities, and what of those opportunities are ones that you can be drawn to for a lifetime. Those are tough questions, but those are the questions that young people must be asking and answering now.
Thank you, Peter. Nubia, he set the stage. What advice would you give to either, business owners or to students as they confront this economy?
Yes, thank you, Natalie. So I just want to very quickly on your question around the presidential election, although I won't necessarily comment on how either will play out, I will say that it's important for our students to vote. It's important for them to use their voice and their political willpower to help frame what the next 4 years of our country will look like. So please register, make sure that you submit your ballot. And then what the advice I'd give to not only our students, but also our business owners and economic investors is to make sure that as you are developing strategies or you're thinking about your contribution, that we're no longer looking at it from just one lens, but that we are thinking about how race affects the implications of our decisions, how gender will it also contribute to either our growth or the decrease of our economy, because it is a multicultural population that lives and breathes and exists and calls Utah home. And so we can no longer just use one approach. There's a lot of studies that are showing that when we approach racial equity as part of our economic recoveries, we stand to gain $8 trillion across the nation. There was a great report written by W.K. Kellogg's Foundation that talks about the business case for racial equity. We can all benefit when we are thinking about the intersectional identities of those that belong in our state and in our country. So make sure that you're including that in your assessment, analysis, and the strategies that we develop.
Thank you, Nubia. Mark, we've only got about 10 seconds for you and 10 seconds for Phil. What's your advice?
It's hard to, don't knock your career decisions offline with the short-term interruptions. Keep the long-term focus, keep an education focus in front of you. Education pays no matter what is happening in the economy.
Great. And Phil, will give you the last word.
Yep. So I would say opportunities are going to be ample if you're flexible. Flexibility is key. And sometimes you have to create your own future, as Peter said.
That's great. I want to thank our panelists. You guys have been great. Peter, Mark, Nubia, Phil, wonderful. This concludes our Informed Decisions 2020 Issues Forums. I want to thank everyone for being here. Stay safe, everyone, and make sure you vote.